The morning Louise Yates buried her husband, the wheat was already turning gold, and she knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her chest like a stone at the bottom of a well, that she could not bring in the harvest alone. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched out in every direction from the Yates homestead like a great golden ocean, the wheat stalks heavy with grain, bending gently in the warm September wind, as if they were nodding to one another about the trouble that had come to this particular patch of earth. Louise stood at the fresh mound of dirt behind the house, her dark hair pulled back under a black bonnet, her hands folded in front of her apron. She did not cry. She had already done her crying in the 3 days since Thomas Yates had taken a fever and declined so fast it seemed the life had simply decided to leave him all at once, rather than slowly, the way she might have preferred, the way that might have given her time to prepare. Thomas had been a good man, a steady man, and now he was gone at 41 years old, and she was 34 and alone on 160 acres of homesteaded land, with a harvest that needed to come in before the first frost or everything they had worked for across 12 years of marriage would be lost along with him. The Reverend Hollies from Calico Creek had read the words over the grave. 2 neighboring families, the Dunns from the East Quarter and old Margaret Pruitt, who lived alone 3 miles south, had come to pay their respects. They had brought food and kind words, and then they had gone home to their own lives and their own harvests, and Louise had stood alone in the kitchen of the farmhouse watching the wheat through the window as the late afternoon light turned everything amber. Her daughter, Clara, who was 12 years old and old enough to understand what a widow's situation meant on the frontier, had come to stand beside her mother without a word. Clara was a serious child, dark-eyed like her father, with her mother's straight spine and her mother's way of facing hard things without flinching. She slipped her small hand into Louise's and they stood there together in the kitchen, watching the wheat move. "Mama," Clara said at last, "what are we going to do?" Louise had squeezed her daughter's hand. "We are going to figure it out," she said. "That is what we are going to do." But figuring it out was easier said than done, and Louise knew it. The nearest town of any size was Calico Creek, about 7 miles east, a modest but growing settlement that had a general store, a livery, a doctor's office, a land office, a church, 2 saloons, and the usual assortment of characters that collected wherever the railroad had made a town possible. Thomas had done his trading in Calico Creek. Louise had been there many times. She knew some of the people well enough to nod to on the street, and a few well enough to speak to, but she had no brothers, no father living, no uncles in the territory. Thomas's own family was back in Missouri, and his brother Harold had written twice in 12 years, and she did not imagine Harold Yates would be riding west to help with the harvest of a woman he barely knew. She needed hired hands. That was the plain truth of it. Men who could work the wheat, swing the cradle scythes through the long rows, bind the grain into shocks, haul it to the thrashing floor. The trouble was that hired hands cost money, and money was a thing that the Yates household had always had just enough of, and never more than that. Thomas had taken a small loan at the land office in the spring to buy new seed, and that loan would be due when the wheat came in. If the harvest was good, they would pay the loan and have a small surplus. If the harvest did not come in at all, the loan would still be due, and Louise did not let herself think too far down that road because it led to a place she refused to go. She spent the evening after the funeral going through the household accounts by lamplight, her pen scratching at the paper while Clara slept. She could afford to hire 2 men, maybe 3, for 2 weeks if she was very careful. It would not be enough. A harvest of this size, 160 acres of wheat, required more hands than that working faster than 2 or 3 men could manage in 2 weeks if the weather held, and the weather on the Kansas plains in September was not something anyone could count on. The next morning she hitched the wagon and drove into Calico Creek. The town was its usual busy self when she arrived, horses tied at rails along the main street, a freight wagon being loaded outside the general store, two men arguing good-naturedly outside the barber's. Louise tied her own horse at the rail in front of the general store and went inside to speak to Eldon Marsh, who owned the store and knew everybody within 20 miles, and who had been a reliable source of information for as long as Louise could remember. Eldon Marsh was a stout, balding man with a kind face and spectacles that he was always adjusting, and he came around the counter when he saw her, his face arranged in the particular expression of sympathy that people wore around the recently bereaved, a sort of gentle, careful concern that Louise was already beginning to find slightly suffocating, even though she understood it came from good hearts. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "I am very sorry for your loss. Thomas was a fine man." "He was," Louise agreed. "Thank you, Eldon. I need to ask you something. I'm looking for men who can help with the harvest. Good workers, reliable. Do you know of anyone who might be available?" Eldon adjusted his spectacles and thought. He told her that the Pruitt boys, Margaret Pruitt's two grown sons, were already committed to bringing in the done harvest and then the Hollander wheat after that. He told her that the Mexican workers who sometimes came through had already passed on east. He mentioned a young man named Roy Sutter who had been asking around for work, but who, he added carefully, had a reputation for being unreliable when it came to finishing what he started. Louise thanked him and went out into the street. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, the September sun warm on her face, thinking. The wheat would not wait forever. Every day she delayed was a day closer to the risk of early rain or frost that would ruin the crop entirely. She was still standing there, working through her limited options, when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Mrs. Yates, from the Yates homestead out on the Creek Road?" She turned around. He was standing in the street beside a bay horse, a man perhaps a few years her senior, maybe 37 or 38, with a lean, sun-darkened face and steady gray eyes that had a quality of directness in them, a way of looking at a person that was not rude but was entirely unguarded. He wore a battered brown hat, a worn canvas work coat, and the boots of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. He was holding his hat in his hands now, which was a courtesy, and he looked like someone who was accustomed to hard work and to spending time alone, the particular stillness of a man who has spent many solitary hours on the open range. "I am," Louise said. "Who are you?" "James Mercer," he said. I used to work for the Double Bar Ranch east of here. I heard what happened to your husband. I am sorry for it, and I heard you might be needing hands for the harvest." Louise studied him for a moment. "Where did you hear that?" "Eldon Marsh mentioned it when I was in the store just before you came in," he said. "He said you'd been asking." "You are looking for work," she said. He hesitated just briefly, just enough for her to notice. "I am in between positions at the moment, yes. And I know how to bring in a wheat harvest. Spent 3 seasons doing it in Nebraska before I came down to Kansas. I am a hard worker, Mrs. Yates. I will not leave the job half done." Louise looked at him for another moment. There was something in his manner that was different from what she had expected, something that was not quite the casual ease of a man selling his labor. He seemed, in some way she could not immediately articulate, as if this offer mattered to him beyond the simple transaction of it. But she was a practical woman standing in the street outside a general store in 1878 with 160 acres of wheat that needed to come in, so she set aside the observation and applied herself to practicalities. "I can offer you board and 2 meals a day and fair wages," she said. "I need at least 2 more men besides yourself. Do you know anyone?" "I do," he said. 2 brothers named Caldwell, Pete and Aaron. They are good workers and they are honest. They would come for fair wages." "Bring them out tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He held her gaze for one more beat before he put his hat back on his head. "I will be there." She drove home with a sense of cautious relief that had just the thinnest edge of something else underneath it. Something she did not examine too closely because she was a woman in mourning and she had a harvest to save, and there was no room for anything else. James Mercer arrived the next morning at first light, just as Louise was building up the kitchen fire, and Clara was setting the table for breakfast. He came with the two Caldwell brothers, Pete, who was 26 and broad-shouldered with a cheerful red face, and Aaron, who was 24 and quieter, and moved with the economical precision of someone who had been doing physical work his whole life. They tied their horses at the fence and came to the back door, and Louise let them in and fed them a proper breakfast of corn bread and salt pork and coffee, because she believed that men who were going to work hard for her deserved to eat well. And then they all went out into the field as the sun was cresting the horizon, and the wheat was lit up in the morning light like something precious and irreplaceable. James Mercer knew what he was doing. That was immediately apparent. He assessed the field with an experienced eye, walking the rows, checking the grain heads with his fingers, looking at the sky. He organized the three of them into a working pattern without making a great production of it, a natural authority in his manner that was not bossy but was quietly confident, and within an hour they were working with the rhythm of men who have found their pace and mean to keep it. Louise worked beside them. She had made it clear from the first that this was her land and her harvest, and she would not stand on the porch watching while men did the work. She was not a frail woman. She had spent 12 years on a homestead, which meant she had spent 12 years doing work that would have surprised people who had only ever seen her in town in her Sunday dress. She could wield a scythe, and she could bind grain, and she could stack the shocks with efficiency and precision. And she did all of those things from that first morning, working steadily through the heat of the day, stopping only when it was necessary, eating a quick midday meal in the shade of the wagon before going back out. She noticed, during that first day, that James Mercer watched her work. Not in an intrusive or inappropriate way, nothing that made her uncomfortable, but with a quality of attention that was different from the way the Caldwell brothers watched her, which was the casual awareness of coworkers. James Mercer watched her the way a person watches something they care about. She noticed it, and then she set it aside, as she had set aside the observation in the street the day before, and she kept working. By the end of the second day, she knew that even with 4 people working from dawn to dusk, they were going to struggle to bring in the whole crop before the weather turned. The field was large and the work was heavy, and even a good pace was going to bring them very close to the edge of the safe window. She did the calculations in the evening by lamplight, and her mouth thinned. On the third morning, she mentioned this to James as they were walking out to the field. It was before the Caldwell brothers had arrived, and for just a few minutes it was only the two of them in the early morning quiet, the dew still on the grass, the sky going from dark blue to the pale gold of dawn. "We are not going to be fast enough," she said. "Not the 4 of us. I have looked at the field and I have looked at what we have done, and at this pace we will not finish before the second week." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. "What does the almanac say about the weather?" "Nothing, I trust," she said. "It never rains in September, and then it rains in September, and there is no telling." He nodded slowly. "There is something I can do," he said. "There is a man in town, an older fellow named Buck Harlan, who has a thrashing machine. It is an old one, but it works. If you were to hire the machine and the 2 boys who operate it, we could get through this field in time." Louise thought about her careful accounts in the lamplight. "How much does Buck Harlan charge for the machine?" "I know Buck," James said. "I can talk to him." She looked at him. "I do not need charity, Mr. Mercer." "It is not charity," he said steadily. "It is negotiating a fair price. That is a different thing." She held his gaze for a moment. In the pale morning light, his gray eyes were very clear, and there was something in them that she had been noticing over these 3 days, something warm and careful and almost painful in its sincerity, and it made her feel, for just a moment, less alone than she had felt since Thomas died. She looked away. "Speak to him," she said, "but I want to know the number before anything is agreed." "Of course," he said. He rode into town that evening after the day's work was done and came back with a price that was, she had to admit when she checked her accounts, something she could manage if she was careful. Buck Harlan's thrashing machine would come out in 4 days, giving them time to get more of the crop cut and ready, and with the machine doing the thrashing, the speed of the whole operation would increase significantly. She told James the price was acceptable and he nodded, and then, because it was evening and the light was low and Clara had gone in to start supper and they were alone at the fence for just a moment, she said, "Thank you for thinking of it." "You would have thought of it yourself," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "But I was worried about the cost. You have a lot to carry right now," he said quietly. It was a simple thing to say, a plain and obvious thing, but the way he said it, without the careful constructed sympathy of Eldon Marsh or the Reverend Hollies, but with a directness that acknowledged the reality of what she was facing without dressing it up or making it softer than it was, landed differently than sympathy usually landed. It sat in her chest for a moment before she could move. "Yes," she said, "I do." They stood at the fence for a moment longer in the quiet of the evening, the wheat field lit in the last orange light of the sun. And then Clara called from the house that supper was ready, and Louise straightened and went inside. Over the following days the work continued, and so did Louise's observation of James Mercer, because she was a woman who paid attention to things, and James Mercer was proving to be a thing worth paying attention to. He worked harder than the Caldwell brothers, not because he was stronger, though he was clearly a strong man, but because he seemed constitutionally incapable of slowing down when there was work to be done. He was always the first in the field in the morning and always the last to leave it at dusk. He did not complain about the heat or the dust or the cut of the scythe handle against his palms. He was patient with Pete Caldwell's constant talking, and with Aaron Caldwell's occasional sullenness, and with Clara, who was sometimes in the field helping and sometimes underfoot in the way that 12-year-olds are when they are trying to be useful, and have not quite figured out where useful ends and inconvenient begins. He was particularly good with Clara. He spoke to her as if she were a full person with a full mind, which she was, and he answered her many questions with patience and sometimes with humor, a dry and understated kind of humor that surprised Louise the first time she heard it because she had taken him for a solemn man. Clara, who had been quiet and watchful since her father's death, began to talk more in the evenings at supper, and Louise noticed that most of her talking was directed at James. The thrashing machine came on the fourth day as promised, driven by Buck Harlan's two workers, a young man called Will and an older one called Joseph, and the addition of the machine and two more workers changed the pace of everything. The field began to come in with real speed now, and Louise, watching the progress from the end of the rows where she was binding the grain, allowed herself to feel something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood as it. She also allowed herself, in those days of relentless work and constant proximity, to begin to know James Mercer better. Not because she sought it out, but because it was the natural result of spending long days working alongside someone and eating meals with them in the evening. She learned that he had come from Tennessee originally, that he had gone west after the war as a young man, not because he had any particular destination in mind, but because staying where he was had felt impossible after everything he had seen. He had spent years working on ranches across Kansas and Nebraska and once, briefly, in Colorado, and he had been at the Double Bar Ranch for 3 years before the owner had decided to reduce his operation and let several hands go, and James had been among them, which was why he was between positions. "Do you have family?" she asked him one evening. It was nearly the end of the first week and they were sitting on the porch after supper, Louise in the wooden chair Thomas had made and James on the steps, their coffee cups in hand, the field dark and still around them, the stars absolutely brilliant overhead the way they could be on the plains on a clear night with no town close enough to dim them. "My mother is in Tennessee," he said. "She is elderly now, a sister in Missouri, a brother who died in the war." He said the last part without drama, the way a person says a thing they have long since made their peace with. "No wife, no children. The war took a great deal from a great many people," she said quietly. "It did," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Your husband, was he from Kansas? Missouri, she said. We came west in '66. He wanted the land. He wanted to build something. She looked out at the field. He built it. I intend to keep it. She said that last part with a certainty that surprised even herself, a firmness she had not known she possessed until it came out in those words, sitting on the porch in the dark with the wheat field around them. James Mercer turned his head and looked at her, and in the starlight she could see that he was almost smiling, not a smile of amusement but of something else, something like recognition or admiration, and she found that it warmed her in a way that she immediately felt guilty about, and then told herself she was being foolish, because a man looking at her with admiration in his eyes was not a thing she was obligated to feel guilty about. I believe you will, he said. Clara appeared at the door then, in her nightgown, to say good night, and the moment dissolved back into the ordinary evening, and Louise told her daughter to go to sleep and went in shortly after herself. She lay in her bed in the dark for a long time before sleeping. The second week of the harvest brought hard work, and a new development that set Louise's nerves on edge. A man named Culbert Cole, who owned the largest spread in the area and who was known to have been attempting to buy up smaller homesteads for several years, rode out to the Yates property on a Tuesday morning and stood in the yard in his expensive coat and his silver-buckled belt and made her an offer on the land. He was polite about it. He always was, Louise had heard. He was not the sort of man who used threats directly. He used the threat implied in circumstances, the suggestion that a widow alone on a homestead could not realistically hold what she had, the gentle pushing of doubt. He made his offer, which was lower than the land was worth, and he expressed his condolences about Thomas in a way that managed to sound sympathetic and predatory at the same time, and he suggested that perhaps she might want to think about whether continuing to try to work this land alone was truly in her best interest. Louise had been raised by a woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children on a hardscrabble farm in Ohio, and she had been on the Kansas frontier for 12 years, and she had just buried her own husband and was in the middle of doing the impossible with the harvest, and there was no version of herself that was going to be intimidated by a man in an expensive coat who had never worked a piece of land with his own hands in his life. She told Culbert Cole, in a tone that was perfectly civil, that the Yates homestead was not for sale. She told him this plainly and directly, and with the quiet certainty of someone who is not saying it as a negotiating position, but as a fact about the world. She told him that if he had nothing else to discuss, she hoped he had a pleasant ride back to his own property. Cole had looked at her for a moment with a kind of measuring assessment, the look of a man deciding whether he was dealing with a woman who could be persuaded by a second approach or one who could not. Whatever he read in Louise Yates' face apparently settled the question, at least for now, because he tipped his hat and rode away. James Mercer had been close enough to hear the exchange. He had been working near the barn, and he had come to stand in the yard during the conversation, not intervening, not speaking, but present, the way a man is present when he thinks something might need responding to. When Cole rode away, James looked at Louise and she looked at him. He will come back, James said. It was not a question. Probably, she agreed. He will find that I am the same person each time he does. Something moved across James Mercer's face then, something that was all the way to the surface before he seemed to realize it, a flash of feeling so unguarded and open that Louise felt it almost like a physical thing, the warmth of it. He nodded once and went back to work. That night at supper, he was quieter than usual, and she watched him without appearing to, the way she had gotten very good at watching him over these days of work. He ate his supper and answered when Clara spoke to him and cleared his plate and thanked her for the meal as he always did, every evening without exception, the manners of a man who genuinely meant his thanks. And when Clara had gone to bed and Louise was washing the dishes and James was sitting at the kitchen table finishing his coffee, she turned and said, "You do not need to be worried about Cole." "I know you can handle Cole," he said. That was not in doubt. Then what were you thinking about at supper? She asked, because she was a direct woman and she had learned over these 12 days that James Mercer responded to directness. He looked at her for a moment. The lamp was between them on the table and the light was warm and low, and the kitchen smelled of supper and coffee, and the particular dusty sweetness of the wheat that clung to everything on the homestead now, to their clothes and their hair and the curtains at the windows. I was thinking, he said carefully, that you should not have to face men like Cole alone. I am not alone, she said. You were there. I know, he said, but I will not always be here. The words landed strangely and she turned back to the dishes because she was not ready to look at him when she asked what she asked next. When will you go? She said. There was a pause. When the harvest is done, he said. She nodded even though her back was to him. Of course, she said. That was always the arrangement. He said nothing to that. She heard the quiet of the kitchen, the small sounds of the night outside, the creak of the house. After a while he said good night and went out to the bunkroom they had cleared in the barn for him and the Caldwell brothers, and Louise stood at the dishpan for longer than the dishes required. The harvest was 2 days from completion. She had done the calculations that afternoon. 2 more full days of work and the crop would be in. 2 days. She fell asleep that night thinking about what the farm would look like after the harvest was done and the thrashing machine had gone and the Caldwell brothers had taken their wages and ridden away, and James Mercer was gone too, and the homestead was herself and Clara, and 160 acres of stubble field and a winter ahead. The second to last day of the harvest brought a change in the weather. The sky went from clear to the particular bruised yellow-gray of approaching storms by mid-afternoon, and James looked at it and said they needed to push hard for the rest of the daylight hours. Everyone understood and nobody argued. They worked in the thick stillness that comes before Kansas weather, the air heavy and unmoving, the sweat immediate and relentless, working through until the light failed them and the first rumbles of distant thunder were threading through the dark sky to the west. They came in to supper later than usual, all of them dirty and exhausted, and Louise had kept the food warm and the coffee hot, and she fed everyone without ceremony. And then Pete and Aaron and Will and old Joseph went out to the barn, and it was again just herself and James and Clara in the kitchen as the storm moved closer, and the thunder became more regular, and the lamp flickered once when the first wind hit the house. Clara was tired and went to bed readily that night, which was unusual for her. Louise sat at the table with her coffee and her accounts, and James sat across from her, and she was aware, with a sharpness that she had not been expecting, of how familiar this had become. This particular table, this particular lamp, this particular man across from her. 12 days had built a kind of familiarity that felt longer than 12 days, the way time works differently when you are working hard together towards something that matters. Tomorrow we finish, she said, looking at the accounts. Yes, he said, if the storm does not hit tonight and wash out the field. Please do not say that, she said. She heard the ghost of a smile in his voice when he said, the storm looks like it is going north of us. She looked up from the accounts. How do you know? The way the wind is moving, he said. I have been watching weather on the plains for a long time. I could be wrong, but I think it will go north. It did go north. She knew it the next morning when she woke to clear sky and the field still standing intact in the golden September light, the storm having taken itself somewhere else overnight and left the Yates homestead untouched. She stood at the back door for a moment with her coffee and felt something large and inarticulate moving in her chest, a feeling she could not entirely name that was part relief and part something fuller and more complicated. James was already in the field when she came out. Of course he was. The last day of harvest had a particular quality to it, the way the last day of something important always does. They all felt it, even Pete Caldwell, who was not given to feeling things particularly, and they worked with a kind of final urgency that was also a kind of celebration, the work becoming its own ceremony. By mid-afternoon the last of the crop was cut and shocked and ready, and when James drove the final load to the thrashing floor and the machine processed the last of it, Louise stood at the edge of the field in the late afternoon light and looked at what they had accomplished. The loan would be paid. There would be a surplus, the winter would be manageable, the homestead would survive. She became aware of James standing nearby. Not immediately beside her but close, the Caldwell brothers and Will and Joseph still busy with the last of the equipment, but James had come to stand at the edge of the field the way she was standing, looking at it. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he said. "We helped." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the field, his hat in his hands again the way it had been that first day in the street outside the general store, and she thought, with sudden and complete clarity, that she could not let him leave tomorrow as if these 2 weeks had been simply a job, as if the conversations on the porch and the suppers in the kitchen and the steadiness of his presence through every hard day were things that could simply be set aside when the work was done. "James," she said. He turned to look at her. The late September light was full on his face, and he looked, in that light, like a man who had something he very much wanted to say, and was not sure he was permitted to say it. "Why did you come?" she said. "Not why you told me you came. I know you said you heard I needed hands, but why did you truly come?" He was quiet for a long moment. The Caldwell brothers were laughing about something behind them. The light was going amber and long across the stubble field. A hawk was riding a thermal high overhead, spiraling slowly against the blue sky. "I have been riding past this place," he said carefully, "for more than a year, when I was working at the double bar. The road to the ranch goes past your south fence." She looked at him. "I used to see you sometimes," he said, "working the garden in the summer, hanging washing on the line. Once I saw you fixing a section of fence yourself in the rain and I thought." He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. "I thought a great many things." "Why did you never stop?" she said. "Because you had a husband," he said simply. "And I'm not that kind of man." The words sat between them in the warm evening air, and Louise felt them settle into her understanding and rearrange several things she had been thinking over the past 12 days. "After I heard what happened," he said, "I thought I should leave it alone. I thought it would not be decent. But then I heard you needed help," and he stopped again. "And," she said, "and I could not come," he said. "I am sorry if that is. I am not trying to." He looked at the field rather than at her. "I just could not stand the thought of you losing this place when I could do something about it." Louise looked at him for a long moment. This lean, sun-darkened man with the steady gray eyes and the battered hat and the work-roughened hands, who had ridden past her fence for a year and thought a great many things and kept them to himself because he was not that kind of man, who had come to save her harvest not because she had asked him specifically but because he could not bring himself not to come. "You worked for 2 weeks," she said quietly. "Every day, from before dawn until after dark. You negotiated the thrashing machine. You organized the men. You watched that storm last night so you could tell me this morning that it had gone north of us and I did not need to be afraid. You have been—" She stopped and pressed her own mouth together for a moment. "You have been here," she said, "through all of it." "Yes," he said. He turned his head and looked at her, and there was nothing guarded about his eyes now. "Louise." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Mrs. Yates for 2 weeks, and now she was Louise in his voice in the evening light on the edge of her harvested field, and the sound of it in his voice did something to her that was honest and real and not something she intended to apologize for. "You already know why," he said, very quietly. She did know why. She had been knowing why for a week now, seeing it in the way he looked at her, and the way he worked, and the way he spoke to Clara, and the way he sat across the table from her in the evenings, as if there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. She had been knowing it and telling herself she was imagining it or misreading it, or that it was too soon or too much, and all of those arguments fell away now in the face of the plain truth of what he had said, and what she felt standing here in the autumn light on her own land that she was going to keep. "Yes," she said, "I know why." They looked at each other for a moment that felt longer than it was, the way certain moments do, as if time has decided this particular one deserves more space than the ordinary seconds it technically occupies. Then Pete Caldwell hollered from behind them that the equipment was loaded up and did they want to come look. And the moment broke, and they both turned, and Louise was smiling. A real smile, the kind that had not come naturally in weeks, and James Mercer was smiling too, and they walked back toward the others side by side. That evening the mood at the supper table was celebratory in the quiet way of people who are too tired for exuberance, but who feel genuine satisfaction. Louise had made a proper meal, chicken and biscuits and gravy, and a dried apple pie that she had been saving the ingredients for, and Buck Harlan's men ate well and said so, and the Caldwell brothers were louder than usual with good humor, and Clara sat at the table beaming with an energy that seemed incongruous with how tired she had been only the night before, the particular resilience of 12-year-olds. After supper, when Will and Joseph had ridden back toward town, and the Caldwell brothers had retreated to the barn for the night, Clara lingered at the table with her mother and James, and she looked between the two adults with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has been paying attention to things that adults assume she has not noticed. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "are you leaving tomorrow?" James looked at Clara and then at Louise and then back at Clara. "I had planned to," he said. Clara considered this. "That seems like a shame," she said, with the uncomplicated directness of a child who has decided what she thinks and sees no reason not to say it. "We still have a lot of work to do before winter." Louise opened her mouth to tell her daughter that this was grown-up business, and perhaps she should leave the managing of the hired men to her mother, but James was already responding. "What kind of work?" he said, and he was asking Clara seriously, as if this were a legitimate business conversation. Clara listed several things. The chicken coop roof needed repair. There were fence sections along the east boundary that needed attention. The root cellar door had been sticking since summer. The wagon's rear wheel had a loose iron rim that had been worrying her mother for 2 months. She went through this list with the thoroughness of someone who had been thinking about it, and Louise sat back and watched her daughter present the case with a slight smile that she could not entirely keep off her face. When Clara was done, James looked at Louise. "Those all sound like legitimate concerns," he said. "They are," Louise agreed. "But the harvest was the arrangement, Mr. Mercer. I cannot ask you to stay on indefinitely when you have other prospects to pursue." "What if I don't have other prospects I'm in a hurry to pursue?" he said. "Then that would be a different conversation," she said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Clara looked between them with an expression of studied innocence that did not fool either adult. "Clara," Louise said, "it is time for bed." Clara said good night with a degree of contentment that was slightly theatrical and went upstairs, and the kitchen settled back into the particular quiet of just the two of them and the lamp and the sound of the Kansas night outside. "I would like to stay," James said simply. "If you will have me, not to impose on you, I can earn my place. I can fix those things Clara mentioned and anything else that needs doing before winter. When the snow comes, I can move on if you prefer. But I would like to stay." Louise thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about the household accounts, carefully and with attention to all of the details. And what she found when she was done thinking was that the details all pointed the same direction, and so did something considerably less practical that lived somewhere in the region of her chest. "There is something I should say first," she said. "Thomas died 6 weeks ago. I am not going to pretend that I am not still in a period of grief. I am. He was my husband for 12 years and I loved him, and his passing has left a wound that is going to take time. I think you deserve to know that clearly." "I know it," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you for anything except permission to be here, to be useful. Whatever comes after that or does not come, I will not press you." She looked at him. "You are a patient man," she said. "With things that matter," he said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then stay," she said. "For now, through the winter at least, and we will see what we see." The relief and something warmer than relief that moved across his face at that was quiet and genuine, and he said simply, "Thank you, Louise." She said, "Good night, James," and went upstairs, and she lay in bed that night listening to the sounds of the homestead settling into its nighttime quiet and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, that the weight on her chest was slightly less than it had been. The weeks that followed the harvest were the weeks of autumn settling in, the days shortening and the air sharpening and the light going to the flat gold of October, and then the thinner, clearer blue-white of November. James Mercer stayed, and he proved as good as his word in every respect. He fixed the chicken coop roof and the fence sections, and the root cellar door and the wagon wheel. And beyond those specific tasks, he took on the general labor of keeping a homestead running as winter approached, all of it done with the same steady competence and ungrudging thoroughness that had characterized his work during the harvest. But more than the work, he was simply there, and being there turned out to be its own thing, separate from and larger than any particular task. He was there at breakfast, and he was there in the evenings, and he was there when the first hard frost came in mid-October and Louise worried about the root vegetables, and he helped her cover the garden beds at 4 in the morning without being asked, because he had heard the temperature drop and known what it would mean. He was there when Clara came home from her lessons at the church school one November afternoon, in tears, because a boy named Henry Pruitt had told her that her mother was going to lose the homestead, because women could not run land alone, and James had sat with Clara at the kitchen table and told her plainly that Henry Pruitt did not know what he was talking about, and that her mother was one of the most capable people he had ever met, and that the Yates homestead was going to be standing a great deal longer than Henry Pruitt's opinion of it. Louise had been listening from the other room, and she had stood very still with her hand on the wall for a moment before going in. She and James had many conversations in those autumn evenings, and the conversations were different from the harvest conversations, longer and less carefully contained, the kind of talking that happens when people have decided they can be honest with each other and are letting that permission expand. They talked about the land and the future and what she planned to plant in the spring and what the territory was likely to look like in another decade. They talked about the war carefully because it was still a tender thing for many people, and about what the country had become afterward and what it was still becoming. James had his own views on this, and they were not simple views, and she found that she liked this about him, that he had thought about things and had opinions that were his own, and was not afraid to say them even when they were complicated. One evening in early November, with snow just beginning to dust the ground outside the kitchen window, she told him about her mother in Ohio, about the 2 husbands buried and the 5 children raised, and the farm that had never been more than barely enough but had always somehow been enough. She told him how she had grown up watching her mother work that farm with a kind of fierce and private love for the land itself, not just for what it produced but for the land as a thing in itself, and how she had brought that same feeling with her to Kansas when she came west with Thomas. "This land is not just an asset to me," she said. "It is not simply a crop or a loan or an investment. It is a place. It is the place I intend to be." "I know," he said. He was looking at her across the table, and the lamp was between them, and the snow was making its soft sound against the window, and his gray eyes were very warm. "I have known that from the first, from riding past my fence," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that surprised her, a teasing edge she had not quite intended. "From riding past your fence," he agreed, and he was smiling, that understated smile that she had come to watch for because it was, she had decided, one of the most attractive things she had ever seen. She looked down at her coffee cup and felt the warmth in her face. Thomas had been gone for a little more than 2 months now. The grief was still there, a real and present thing, but it had shifted from the acute, stunning blow of the early weeks to something more like a deep ache, the permanent alteration of a person by a significant loss, the way you adjust your weight when you are carrying something heavy for a long time. She was adjusting, and James Mercer was part of the landscape of that adjustment in a way that was becoming less and less something she could describe as simply practical. She also knew, because she was not a woman who liked pretending things were simpler than they were, that the situation had a complexity to it that went beyond her own feelings. There were people in Calico Creek and the surrounding area who would have opinions about a widow having a man living on her property. It was 1878, and she was a widow of 2 months, and there was no formal understanding between them. And while she did not particularly care what people thought, she also lived in a community, and Clara went to school in that community, and there were practical considerations. She raised this with James one evening, straightforwardly, as she raised everything with him. He listened. He did not immediately respond with reassurances or with the defensive posture of someone whose motives have been questioned. He took a moment and he thought about it. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are right to consider it. I think the cleanest way to address it is to be clear about my intentions." "And what are your intentions?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "My intention, when you are ready, in whatever time that takes, is to ask you to marry me," he said. "That is my intention. And in the meantime, I think I ought to sleep in the barn, which I have been doing, and conduct myself with complete propriety, which I have been doing, and let people in town see that this is a working arrangement between a widow and a hired hand, which it also is." Louise was quiet for a moment. "When you said 'when I am ready,'" she said. "Yes," he said. "Thomas has been gone only 2 months. I know, people would say it was too soon. People would," he agreed. "I am not asking now. I am telling you what my intention is, so that you know. So that if you do not want me to have that intention, you can tell me, and I will adjust my expectations, and we will not speak of it again." She looked at him for a long moment. The snow was steady now outside the window, proper snow, the first of the season, soft and quiet. "I do not want you to adjust your expectations," she said. He nodded once, a small movement, and she saw his breath go out slowly, and she realized that he had been more uncertain than he had appeared, that the certainty of his manner had been partly effort, and that this made her feel tenderly toward him in a way that was its own kind of revelation. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we will let time do what time does." And they did. December came, and with it the hard Kansas winter, the kind that makes the plains into a world of white and wind, and makes the distances seem immense, and the farmhouse seem like the only warm thing in an enormous cold universe. James had laid in a good supply of firewood through October and November, more than she would have thought to ask for, and the house stayed warm through the worst of the cold spells. He winterized the barn and kept the horses and the livestock healthy through the cold, and on the worst days when going out was genuinely difficult he found tasks inside, repairing tools and equipment, things that needed doing and had been deferred in favor of more urgent work. On Christmas Day, Louise made the best dinner she could from what they had: a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes from the root cellar and cornbread and a small cake sweetened with the last of the sugar, and the three of them sat at the table together, and it felt, in a way that Louise recognized with a kind of gentle bittersweet ache, like something close to a family. Not the same family she had had. Never that again. But something real and present in its own thing. Clara had gotten James a small gift, a new pair of work gloves she had ordered from the catalog in town, saving her pocket money for 2 months to do it. James held the gloves for a moment when he unwrapped them and looked at Clara, with an expression that Louise thought might have been the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, and he thanked her with a simplicity that said everything the words didn't. He had gotten Clara a book, a real book, ordered from the catalog in Calico Creek, a collection of stories and poems that Clara unwrapped with a reverence usually reserved for church, and he had gotten Louise, after considerable evident thought, a new journal with a good leather cover, for her accounts and her records. "Because the old one is nearly full," he said, a little carefully, as if he was not entirely certain whether it was an appropriate gift, and Louise had held the leather journal and thought that he had noticed the old one was nearly full and had thought about what she would need next, and she had felt a warmth in her throat that made speaking temporarily complicated. "Thank you," she said. "It is exactly right." The winter went on. January and February with their ferocious cold, and then the first softening of March, the days beginning to lengthen and the snow beginning to release its grip on the earth in slow stages. Louise began to feel the spring in herself the way she always did, that stirring, the beginning of plans for the planting season, the first cataloging of what seeds she had and what she needed and what she intended to grow. She and James spent the evenings in March going over the planting plan for the year, discussing what to put in which fields and what rotation would be best and whether to increase the wheat acreage or diversify a little. And these conversations had the quality of partnership, two people with the same stake in the same thing thinking together toward the same goal. It was not a thing she was going to pretend she did not notice. On a mild March evening, 5 months after Thomas's death, with the sound of spring beginning outside the kitchen window and the lamp low and warm between them, James said, "Louise." She looked up from the planting ledger. "I told you in November that I intended to ask you to marry me when you were ready," he said. "I am not going to presume to know when that is, but I want you to know that the intention has not changed." She put her pen down. She folded her hands on the table. She considered what she was going to say, and then she said it. "Thomas Yates was a good man," she said. "He was my husband, and I loved him as a wife loves a husband she has built her life with, and I will always carry him in my memory. But he is gone, and the life I am living now is the life I have, and you are in it, James. You are in it in every important way." She looked at him squarely. "So yes, I am ready." James Mercer looked at her across the lamp on the kitchen table, and the entirety of what he felt was on his face, open and unguarded, the feeling of a man who has waited a long time for something and is not quite sure yet that it is real. "Then I am asking," he said, "Louise Yates, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the table and took her hands in his and held them, and she held his hands back. And they sat like that in the kitchen for a long, quiet moment before he stood up and came around the table. And she stood too, and he kissed her, gently, carefully. A kiss that was careful with her and also entirely certain of itself. The kiss of a man who has known what he wanted for a long time and is treating the having of it with the seriousness it deserves. Clara, who had been asleep upstairs, came down in the morning to find her mother and James at the breakfast table, and something different in the quality of the morning, a lightness in her mother's face that she had not seen in a long time. She looked between the two adults. "You are going to get married, aren't you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Louise said, "if you are agreeable." Clara sat down at the table and considered this with the gravity of a 12-year-old who takes her responsibilities seriously. Then she said, "I think Papa would be glad. He always said the land needed someone to take care of it." "The land will be taken care of," James said. Clara nodded. "Then I am agreeable," she said, with a dignity that made both adults smile. They were married in May in Calico Creek by Reverend Holly's in the small church where Louise had buried Thomas 6 months before. It was a small ceremony. Eldon Marsh and his wife attended. Margaret Pruitt came, walking the 3 miles herself and arriving pink-cheeked and determined. The Caldwell brothers showed up, both of them in clean shirts with their hats in their hands, grinning. Clara stood at her mother's side in her best dress, her dark eyes serious and bright. Louise wore the blue dress she had been saving, a fine wool the color of a September sky, and she carried a small bunch of wild prairie flowers that Clara had gathered that morning. And she stood before Reverend Holly's and James Mercer, and said her vows with the same clarity and directness she brought to everything, because she was not a woman who said things she did not mean, and she meant every word. James said his vows looking at her the whole time, never breaking eye contact, the steady gray eyes absolutely direct. And when he said the words, he meant them in the particular way of a man who has waited for something important and knows exactly what he is committing to. After the ceremony, Eldon Marsh's wife had organized a small celebration in the churchyard, with food that the community had contributed in the way communities do, and there was laughter and conversation, and Clara ate 3 pieces of cake, and then felt unwell, and was completely better again within the hour. The resilience of the young. Pete Caldwell made a toast that was slightly too long and became slightly too emotional near the end, but was warmly received regardless. Margaret Prewitt held Louise's hands for a moment and said, "He is a good man," with the authority of someone who had observed a great deal of humanity over a long life, and Louise said, "I know," and Margaret nodded and was satisfied. They drove home to the homestead in the late afternoon, the 3 of them in the wagon, Clara between them on the seat as the May sun went low and golden across the plain, and the homestead came into view along the road, the farmhouse and the barn and the fields, the land she had refused to sell to Culbert Cole, the land she had brought in the harvest on with 4 men, and a thrashing machine in September while she was still raw with grief, the land she intended to hold. James put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat beside Clara, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they rode the last mile home together in the warm evening light. The years that followed were not always easy, because life on the Kansas frontier in the 1880s was not designed to be easy, but they were good years in the deepest sense of the word, years with substance and fullness to them, years that added up to something real. The summer of their first year of marriage, Louise planted a kitchen garden twice the size of the previous one, and James doubled the wheat acreage, using a method he had learned in Nebraska that proved more productive than what Thomas had been doing, and the harvest that year was the best the homestead had ever produced. The loan from the land office was paid in full, and there was money enough to invest in a new plow and a second horse, both things that made the following year's work easier and more efficient. Culbert Cole came back once more that first autumn, as James had predicted he would, and this time he found not a widow at the door but Louise and James together in the yard, and he made his offer again, more carefully this time, and Louise said no again with the same certainty, and James said nothing at all but stood there in the way he stood when something might need responding to, and Cole looked between them and made his calculations and rode away, and he did not come back after that. The word got around that the Yates Mercer homestead was not a property that could be pressured into a sale, and in the rough democracy of the frontier, that word carried weight. Clara grew. She was an extraordinary child becoming an extraordinary young woman, serious and bright and her mother's daughter in every fundamental way, with a love of the land and a love of learning that sometimes seemed to pull her in 2 directions at once. She attended school in Calico Creek through the winter months and helped on the homestead through the growing season, and she read everything she could get her hands on from the catalog and from Eldon Marsh's surprisingly eclectic stock of books. James had early recognized that her mind was exceptional and encouraged it without ever making her feel that being exceptional was a burden, and Louise watched this with a gratitude that she occasionally had to work to keep from becoming overwhelming. In the spring of 1880, the year Clara turned 14, Louise discovered she was expecting a child. She told James on a Sunday morning in April while they were sitting on the porch with their coffee watching the first green coming up in the field, and she said it plainly and directly, as she did most things, and watched his face. James Mercer's face did something she had never quite seen it do before. It went through several things in quick succession, surprise and something luminous, and then a kind of stillness that was so full it had almost no room for expression. He set down his coffee cup carefully. He looked at her. "Louise," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. He reached over and took her hand and held it very tightly for a moment, the way he had held it on their wedding day, and she felt the realness of him through the grip of his fingers, this solid, steady, real man who had ridden past her fence for a year and thought a great many things and then come to save her harvest and stayed to build a life. "Are you well?" he said. "Completely," she said. "I have done this before, James. I am perfectly capable of it." "I know you are," he said, with a slightly unsteady smile. "I still intend to worry. "I know that too," she said. "The baby came in November of 1880, a boy, arriving into the world in the farmhouse bedroom with the assistance of the doctor from Calico Creek and Margaret Pruitt, who had delivered more babies than she could count, and who managed the whole event with calm authority and tremendous competence." James spent the hours of the labor in a state of contained and thorough anxiety that he tried unsuccessfully to conceal. And Clara, who was 14 and old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to be both fascinated and alarmed, kept him company in the kitchen and made tea. She did not drink, and occasionally said sensible things that helped. When the doctor came out and said Louise and the baby were both well and he could go in, James went through the bedroom door and stood at the side of the bed where Louise lay looking tired and triumphant and entirely herself, and he saw the small red-faced bundle in her arms, and something happened in his chest that he did not have adequate words for. "A boy," Louise said. She was smiling. "A healthy boy." He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, this very new and very small person who had no idea yet what an interesting world he had arrived in. And then he looked at Louise, and he said, "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names. Thomas was not right, too many layers of complication in it, even though Thomas Yates had been a good man. They had talked about family names and biblical names and plain names. "Henry," Louise said. "I have always liked Henry." "Henry Mercer," James said. He tested the sound of it. "Yes." "Henry Thomas Mercer," Louise said. "For what came before?" He looked at her. He nodded. "For what came before," he agreed. Clara came in and met her brother with the same serious, assessing attention she brought to everything important, and she held him for a moment with the carefulness of someone handling something precious and irreplaceable. And Henry Thomas Mercer, who was approximately 4 hours old and had absolutely no context for any of this, looked up at his sister with the unfocused gaze of the very new and seemed to find her satisfactory. Henry grew the way children on the frontier grow, quickly and with great energy and apparent indifference to weather. He was on his feet early and into everything shortly after, and by his second year he was trailing after his father in the field with the consuming seriousness of a small person who has decided this is what real work looks like, and he intends to do it. James bore this with patience and good humor, and found that having a small and very determined boy following him through the wheat rows was something he had not known he wanted until it was happening. Clara, in the meantime, had developed a friendship with the schoolteacher in Calico Creek, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Arden who had come west to teach, and who recognized quickly that Clara Yates was a student who needed more than the usual curriculum could offer. She began to lend Clara books beyond the school library, advanced books, books on natural science and history and literature, and Clara devoured them and came home full of ideas and questions that she brought to the supper table with an enthusiasm that made the evenings lively and occasionally slightly chaotic. In the fall of 1882, Miss Arden informed Louise and James with some excitement that there was a women's normal school in Lawrence offering a program of teacher training, and that Clara was exactly the kind of student they looked for, and that, with Miss Arden's recommendation and the application of some effort, Clara had a real possibility of attending. This was a significant conversation. It meant money, and it meant distance, and it meant change. And the three of them, Louise and James and Clara herself, sat around the kitchen table one October evening and discussed it with the thoroughness the subject deserved. Clara was 16 and passionate about learning, and had the particular look of someone who can see the shape of their future and wants to move toward it. James asked her careful questions about what she wanted and listened to the answers with real attention. Louise looked at her daughter and saw her mother in Ohio, the woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children and never stopped pushing toward something larger, and she made her decision before she knew she had made it. "You will go," Louise said. "We will find a way to manage the cost, and we will find a way to manage without you during the term, and you will go." Clara looked at her mother with an expression that was too large and too complicated for any single word to describe. James reached across the table and covered Louise's hand with his. He said, without any particular emphasis, simply because it was true and he thought it needed to be said, "Your mother is the best person I have ever known." Clara looked between them and then she laughed, a real laugh, the laugh of a 16-year-old who is full of the bright specific joy of a future opening up in front of her. And the kitchen was full of it, that laugh, bouncing off the walls and filling the room with something warm and alive. The following years were the years of building and growing, the natural accumulation of a life being lived with full attention and good faith. Henry Mercer grew from a toddling shadow at his father's heels into a sturdy, cheerful, competent boy of 5, and then 6, and then 7, with his mother's directness and his father's steady gray eyes and a laugh that seemed slightly too large for his body, boisterous and generous. He was interested in everything on the homestead, the horses and the cattle and the wheat, and the mechanical operation of the new equipment that James acquired piece by piece as the homestead expanded and the finances improved. Clara went to the normal school in Lawrence and wrote letters home every week, long detailed letters full of what she was learning, and who she was meeting and how strange and wonderful it was to be in a city after all her years on the plains. Louise kept every letter in a box on the kitchen shelf and read them over sometimes in the evenings by the lamp, smiling at her daughter's voice in the words. In 1884, with Henry 4 years old and Clara home from her first year at the normal school for the summer, Louise told James she was expecting again. She told him at the breakfast table this time, matter-of-factly, pouring his coffee, and his reaction was essentially the same as the first time except that he knocked over the coffee cup in his surprise and had to mop it up with considerable embarrassment while Louise laughed. This baby was a girl, born in the early spring of 1885, arriving with none of the drama of winter and all the gentleness of March. A small and certain baby who Louise held for the first time and felt something deep and specific, the particular love of a mother who has waded through uncertainty and arrived at this exact person. "Ruthie," James said immediately before Louise had said anything, and Louise looked at him. "Where did that come from?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "She looks like a Ruthie." Louise looked at the baby. "She does," she said. Ruth Eleanor Mercer." "Eleanor was my mother's name," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "You told me." He had told her, one evening years ago on the porch, and she had filed it away in the particular place where she kept the important things he told her. And now here it was, returned and made new in the face of a small girl who looked, in fact, remarkably like a Ruthie. Henry met his sister with a gravity that was very much his mother's, inspecting her with serious attention before delivering his verdict. "She is very small. She will get bigger," James told him. "Good," Henry said, apparently satisfied. Clara, who came home that summer and met her sister, declared Ruth to be the most wonderful thing she had ever seen, a statement that was perhaps somewhat excessive, but that was also, Louise thought privately, not entirely wrong. The homestead in the late 1880s was a different place from the homestead of 1878. It had expanded. James had purchased an adjacent 40 acres from a family that left for Colorado in 1883, bringing the total to 200 acres, and the operation was now large enough to require seasonal help at harvest time, which James managed with the same competent organization he had brought to that first harvest, the one that had changed everything. The farmhouse had a new addition on the east side, 2 more rooms that gave Clara her own room when she was home, and gave Henry more space than he had been trying to make do without. The barn was larger and the equipment was better, and there was a proper well near the house, rather than the old one that required a long walk. But what had not changed, and what Louise thought about sometimes on mornings when she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched James crossing the yard or working in the near field, was the essential thing, the particular quality of what they had built together. It was not grand or spectacular. It was not the stuff of legends. It was something quieter and more durable than that. A life made of work and honesty and the daily choice to be present and to keep the promises you made. And it was the most real thing she had ever been part of. One September evening in 1886, 8 years after the harvest that had changed everything, Louise was sitting on the porch after supper. Henry was 6 and asleep. Ruth was 18 months old and also asleep. The days were getting shorter again, the light going to that September gold that always took her back, that particular quality of late-season light that had been the backdrop for the most consequential days of her life. James came out and sat on the steps the way he had always sat, his coffee in hand, the way he had sat the first week they knew each other, before any of what they had built had been built. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while. Then Louise said, "Do you ever think about that first harvest?" He looked at her. "Often," he said. "I thought about it today," she said. "I was in the south field and the light was exactly that same light, that September light, and I thought about that first morning when you organized the men and we all went out at sunrise. I remember," he said. "You picked up a scythe without asking anyone's permission and started working." She smiled. "Did you think that was strange?" "I thought it was exactly right," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about something I never asked you properly," she said. "About that day when the harvest was done, when you told me you already knew why you had come." He turned to look at her. "I did know," she said. "You were right about that. But I have wondered sometimes across all these years whether you knew then, when you first arrived, whether you had any idea what was going to come of it." He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about things, without rushing to the comfortable answer. "I knew I wanted to come," he said slowly. "I knew something in me was very strongly pointed in the direction of this place and this person. Whether I knew it would come to this," he looked out at the field, the familiar field, the one they had harvested together and planted together and harvested again through all the years since. "I hoped," he said. "I hoped very much." She looked at him in the September light, this man she had married in May and built a life with across the years, the father of her children, the keeper of her land, the person she had found her footing with after the ground shifted beneath her in the worst autumn of her life. "I am glad you came," she said. "So am I," he said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. The same chair, Thomas's chair that she still used because the wood was good and the craftsmanship was solid, and there was no reason to set aside a thing that still served its purpose well. He held her hand and she held his back, and they sat together on the porch in the September evening as the stars began to come out over the Kansas plain, the same stars that had been there in the beginning, brilliant and indifferent to human time, vast and permanent overhead. In the house behind them, Henry slept the deep sleep of a 6-year-old who had spent the day running himself to complete exhaustion on a working farm. Ruth slept in her cradle, dreaming whatever small new dreams inhabited her 18-month mind. On the shelf in the kitchen, in a box beside Louise's journals, were Clara's letters, the most recent having arrived just last week from Lawrence, where Clara was in her final year of the normal school and would be coming home in the spring certified to teach, planning to take a position in Calico Creek and close to the homestead she loved. The loan was long paid. The land was fully theirs, no question about it, no possibility of losing it to men in expensive coats with predatory sympathy in their voices. The harvest was in, this year's harvest, a good one, the best yield they had ever gotten from the expanded acreage, and the accounts were solid and the winter stores were full, and the horses were healthy, and the cattle were fat with the last of the summer grass. James Mercer had come to a widow's door in September of 1878, with a hat in his hands and a steady gaze, and the particular quality of presence that Louise had recognized before she had words for what she was recognizing. And he had worked beside her through every day of that harvest and stayed through every season after it. And they had made a life on the land she refused to give up. and their children were sleeping in the house behind them. And the plains stretched out in every direction in the dark and the starlight and the warm September night. Louise leaned her head against the back of the chair and looked at the stars. She felt the solid warmth of James's hand in hers. She felt the quietness of the homestead around them, the breathing life of it, the animals in the barn and the fields resting, and the house with its two sleeping children, and the particular peace of a place that has been worked and loved and kept through difficulty and made into something lasting. She thought of her mother in Ohio, all those years ago, standing in the doorway of a hardscrabble farm with 5 children and 2 graves, and the particular expression of a woman who has made up her mind about something and intends to keep it. She thought of Thomas, honest and steady Thomas, who had wanted the land and had built something on it, and had left it to her when he could no longer stay. She thought of the girl she had been when she first came west, younger and less certain, but somehow already in possession of the spine that would carry her through everything that came after. And she thought of James, riding past her fence for a year on the road to the Double Bar Ranch, seeing her in the garden and at the washing line and fixing a fence section in the rain, thinking a great many things and keeping them to himself because he was not that kind of man, and then coming when she needed help with a hat in his hands and steady gray eyes and the willingness to work until the harvest was done. You already know why. She had known. She had known before he said it, seeing it in the way he worked and the way he watched her, and the way he sat across the table in the evenings as if there was nowhere else in the world he wanted to be. She had known, and she had been right, and everything that had followed from that knowing had been, in the deepest and most honest sense, the fullness of a life. "James," she said. "Huh?" he said, the soft sound of a man who is contentedly somewhere between awake and the first edges of sleep. "I love you," she said. She did not say it every day, not because she did not feel it every day, but because she had been raised by a woman who said things when they mattered and not simply out of habit, and it mattered every time she said it. He turned his head and looked at her in the starlight. The gray eyes were warm. "I know," he said. And then, because he was James Mercer and he had been saying true things to her since the first day in the street outside Eldon Marsh's general store, he said, "And you already know that I love you. You have always known." She smiled. She squeezed his hand. The stars were very bright and the night was warm and the Kansas plain stretched out around them in the dark, and the land was theirs, entirely and permanently theirs, and they were home. Clara came back in the spring, as promised, with her teaching certificate and her letters full of Lawrence packed into a trunk, and a brightness in her face that was the brightness of a young woman who has found out who she is and what she can do. She took a position at the Calico Creek School, teaching the younger children, and proved to be exactly as gifted at it as Miss Arden had predicted. The kind of teacher that children remember their whole lives, clear-eyed and patient and demanding in the particular way that makes students rise to meet her rather than shrink from her. She came home to the homestead every Sunday for dinner, and the Sunday dinners became a thing in themselves, a gathering around the big kitchen table that James had built to replace the old one 2 winters ago, with enough room for all of them and the occasional neighbor, Margaret Pruitt, who was elderly now but still sharp and still walking her 3 miles when she felt like it, and the Caldwells who had settled in the area and had families of their own now. Pete with a wife and 2 boys, and Aaron with a wife and a baby girl. Henry grew into a lanky, bright-eyed boy of 7 and 8 and 9, perpetually in the field after his father, learning the work the way children learn things they are given early and well, with a naturalness that made it look like something they were born knowing. He had a particular talent with the horses, a patience and an instinctive understanding of them that James recognized and encouraged, teaching him carefully and systematically everything he knew about the animals. Ruth walked and then talked in the cheerful, unstoppable fashion of a child with 2 older siblings and 2 parents who listened to her. And she was a happy child, fundamentally and constitutionally happy in a way that Louise sometimes looked at with a private gratitude that went very deep, because she had known what it was to carry weight too heavy for a person's frame, and she was glad, more glad than she could easily say, that her small daughter seemed to be built for lightness. The years of the late 1880s were years of change in the territory and in the wider country, the frontier being pressed back, and the towns growing, and the railroad reaching further, and the nature of the life on the plains shifting in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes complicated, and sometimes both at once. Louise followed these changes with the attention she brought to everything, reading the newspapers when they could get them, and listening to what travelers and the merchant community in Calico Creek said about what was happening beyond the immediate horizon of the homestead. She had opinions about much of it, as she had always had opinions, and she and James discussed these things in the evenings as they had always discussed everything. Two people with enough respect for each other's mind to engage honestly with the difficult questions as well as the easy ones. The treatment of the native peoples who had been in this land before any homesteader arrived was something Louise had thought about and felt the weight of, the injustice of it, the way the expansion that had given her and Thomas their land had taken something from others, a truth that sat uncomfortable and real alongside the love she bore for her homestead and what she had built on it. She raised this at the supper table sometimes, not to resolve it, because it could not be resolved in a kitchen conversation, but because she believed in the value of naming true things even when they were not comfortable, and she wanted Henry and Ruth to grow up knowing how to hold complicated truths. James listened when she spoke of these things and offered his own observations, which were careful and honest, the observations of a man who had seen a great deal of the frontier and had his own reckoning to do with what that had meant and what it had cost people who had no say in the matter. These were not simple conversations, and they did not arrive at simple conclusions, but they were real conversations, and Louise believed in real conversations. In the autumn of 1889, the year Henry turned 9 and Ruth turned 4 and Clara turned 23, and was deeply settled in her life in Calico Creek with her teaching and her books and her growing reputation as one of the most capable young women in the county. James Mercer walked out to the south field one September morning at first light, and stood at the edge of it in the same light, the same September light that had been there at the beginning. And Louise came out of the house and walked across the yard to stand beside him. They stood together at the edge of the field. The wheat was in, this year's harvest safely gathered by now, and the field was stubble in the morning light, gold and brown and alive with the small sounds of the early day. 11 years. 11 years from that first morning when 4 people had walked into a wheat field at sunrise on a homestead in Kansas and begun the work that had changed everything. James put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood there in the September morning, and the world was quiet and full and entirely real around them. "Same light," he said. "Same light," she agreed. She put her arm around his waist and held on, and the sun came up over the Kansas plain and lit everything gold, the way it had always done and would do long after both of them were gone, the same light on the same earth, patient and vast, and indifferent to the small, particular, beautiful human story that had played out beneath it across these years. But they were not gone. They were here, on the land they had saved and built and kept, and the house behind them had children in it who were waking up now to the sounds of morning, Henry clattering down the stairs with his usual complete absence of stealth, Ruth's voice starting up in the particular bright stream of early morning talking that had characterized her since she could form words. Clara would come on Sunday and sit at the big table, and the dinner would be loud and good. The wheat would grow again in the spring, and the harvest would come again in the fall, and the years would stack up into a life. Their life. The one they had chosen and built from the foundation of a September morning when a cowboy had taken off his hat and offered his hands and meant so much more than the words he said. Louise Yates, who had become Louise Mercer, who had been a widow on a harvest deadline, and a woman who refused to sell, and a mother and a wife, and the keeper of 160 acres of Kansas plain that had become 200, felt the solid warmth of James's arm around her and the morning light on her face, and heard her children waking in the house behind her. And she thought that life, for all its capacity to break a person, had a corresponding and equal capacity for this fullness, this rightness, this ordinary, extraordinary, ordinary morning standing in the field with the man who had known why before he said it, and had said it anyway and had stayed. She turned her face up toward him. He looked down at her, and they were home, completely and permanently, and in every sense that the word could hold, home.